Welcome back to the last conversation workshop today about housing. The topic of this one is 100% focused on permitting. And we'll, have a facilitated conversation around some of those opportunities for lessons learned both before the storm and as a result of Hurricane Ian, of what we can think about related to some solutions for permitting and all of the different aspects of that for our community and how that helps us get to more attainable and resilient housing. Before we jump into some introductions, I just want to do a couple housekeeping items. So we do have folks joining us virtually, and this is streamed live and being recorded. So you all have microphones in front of you, the branch here to my right, and then the panel here to my left. Please make sure you hit the button, turn the light from red to green, and speak into the microphone so folks on Zoom can hear us. The other thing is we have branch members joining us virtually as well. Please jump in or drop your questions or your comments into the chat. We are monitoring that in order to make sure that those things get addressed to the panel. And then for branch members that are attending in person, this is intended to be a dialogue to learn more, to inform the initiatives and the solutions for the overall resiliency plan that we will get to in a minute. I do want to make sure that we keep this on the solution side. We know there have been some challenges post-storm related to things around permitting, but we want to get to what are those solutions so we can solve for some of our housing challenges and our other challenges in our community. So we will make sure that we understand the complexity of what has happened and what's happened before, but we want to make sure we're driving towards solutions as well. So with that, we're going to do some welcomes and introductions. Real quick, my name is John Romine. I'm part of the support team for the Resiliently Recovery Task Force. I'm also a team member here at Collaboratory. And what we are really hoping to get to here in a little bit is a facilitated back and forth conversation and dialogue to understand some of the things and opportunities related to permitting. So I'm going to, we do have a couple panelists on Zoom. I'll get to you at the end, but I'm going to start with you. Quick introduction, name, organization, and then we'll work our way down the line.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Smalley. I'm the senior planner for the town of Fort Myers Beach within the Community Development Department.
Hey, everybody. Frank Wells, President, Bright Community Trust.
Amy Yearsley, Planning Manager, City of Cape Coral.
Terry Ware, Senior Manager at Haggerty Consulting.
Hi, I'm Harrison Newton, Haggerty Consulting on the Resiliently support team. I lead the Resilient portfolio for Haggerty. Thanks.
Thanks, Harrison. All right, we have Jacqueline from Bonita Springs and Audra from Lee County. If each of you could come off mute and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hey, good afternoon, Jacqueline Ginson with Bonita Springs Community Development. I'm the Planning and Zoning Manager.
Audra Ennis with Lee County DCD. I am the Regulatory Review and Permitting Manager.
Great, thank you. And so first, I just want to say thank you for taking the time. I know it's Friday afternoon. Really appreciative of, oh, we have one more. All right. Craig Chandler from Sanibel.
Yes, hello. Craig Chandler, Deputy Director of the Planning Department for the City of Sanibel.
Great, thank you. So we will be monitoring the participation from folks on Zoom. And so panelists, please use the raise hand function if you want to chime in on a specific conversation. So again, my gratitude for you all being here and taking the time on this Friday afternoon. And for those of you who have participated in most of the week. I want to give you a high-level overview of what the Recovery Task Force is for those who may not be aware. So Recovery Task Force are created, after disaster events that occur in communities. This is based on a FEMA framework, happen around the country. This one specifically in Lee County is chaired by the County Commission, specifically Commissioner Kevin Ruane. And then the remaining 12 members come from the different elected entities across Lee County as a geography. So you have the municipalities, you have law enforcement, the fire districts, the school board, the health system, a representative from our legislative delegation, as well as a representative from the constitutional office. The task force itself is broken into 8 branches. So you have planning and capacity, which is really looking at a higher level overview of the county as a whole and what are some of those policy adjustments that may need to be made for the entire county. Things like they're talking about like a resilience overlay, economic recovery, education and workforce, health and social services, infrastructure, housing, which branch member Gary Griffin leads that one, natural resources and cultural resources. And today, while a lot of the conversation around permitting is around housing, it's also thinking about how it connects into all of the other things that we've discussed earlier in the week. We've been on a very, very aggressive timeline. It's getting more aggressive as I feel the week goes on. And we started late February, early March. And in those earlier few months leading up to today, we've really been gathering information from the community, gathering information from the branch members, which are made up of members of our community, but ultimately driving towards what are the solutions to make Lee County more resilient. And so the idea is that this is an inclusive plan to address some of the challenges that we may have had before the storm, but challenges that we've definitely faced after the storm. And so how do we, to Gary's earlier point, how do we leverage the resources that are going to be available and take advantage of the opportunity to make this community more resilient for the long term? And so we did just exit a robust community engagement. I'll touch on some of the input from that or the participation from that. But for the next couple months leading up to late summer, early fall, we will be gathering solutions and defining what this actual plan will be that gets voted on December 5th by the Board of County Commissioners. It will go back out for community engagement before it is adopted or voted on. And so that'll be where the community can give another look of, hey, what's missing? Where did we get this right? And where maybe we need to make a couple adjustments to make this the plan of our community. So as it relates to community engagement, we hosted 17 town halls. 2 were virtual, 1 in English, 1 in Spanish, and then 15 were throughout the community based on the planning communities of Lee County. And so these were in community, in person, in English and Spanish to really understand what are the priorities of the community. And as we know, this storm hit the coast really hard. And inland, it didn't hit as bad. There were still impacts, but there were impacts from Irma in 2017 inland that we didn't experience maybe necessarily on the coast. So how do we understand how to make those communities more resilient all of the time? We had a little more than 1,000 people participate in those town halls. And then in addition to that, on the resiliently.com website, there's a survey. It's still active, still live. If you know folks that haven't completed it, please share with them. But we're about 5,000 folks have shared what their priorities are and what their ideas are for this plan. And then on March 30th, throughout the region, so an additional 4 counties of Charlotte, Collier, Henry, and Glades, there was an on the table event, which was a day-long opportunity for folks to gather around a meal or coffee or just sit around. I went to a barbershop and have a conversation about what are the priorities and the opportunities for our community. And we had a little over 1,000 folks participate in that survey as well to sort of inform post-Ian, specifically the Lee County opportunities for our community. And as I've shared in both the workshops today, housing is the #1 priority for everywhere in Southwest Florida. So this isn't something that I think surprises anybody that's in this room. So this week has been all about workshops. And so we kicked it off on Monday. We had a conversation about critical infrastructure. We discussed everything except power on Monday. That workshop will be on June 21st here at Collaboratory at 2 o'clock. And then on Wednesday, we moved into this conversation about supporting business and workforce. Yesterday, we talked all about community resilience, and then today has been all about housing. And you probably aren't surprised, in every one of those workshops, didn't matter what we were talking about, there was a housing conversation component to each of them. So housing has definitely been the conversation. today for this workshop for the next couple hours, we have subject matter experts in person and on Zoom that were identified by branch members and others from the community of folks that could help maybe answer questions, get into some further detail about what are the opportunities and what are the solutions and maybe some of those challenges to get to those solutions that we can start to prioritize for the resiliently plan. So that is what we hope to get out of this conversation. And as I shared, branch members on Zoom, please drop your questions or comments in chat. Branch members in person, just try to get our attention and make sure we can make this a back and forth dialogue to understand what you need help with. This whole process is a public community input process also. And so at the end of all of at the end of this workshop, we have opportunity for public comment. Branches, they meet on a monthly basis. They actually all meet next week. Those also have an opportunity for public comment. And then the Recovery Task Force meets the fourth Friday of every month, also opportunity for public comment. So again, these opportunities exist in order for people to participate in the process to make sure that this plan is driving towards what makes sense for the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry, and we're going to have a little conversation around permitting and housing.
Thanks, John. I'm going to skip most of these because fortunately, this is a pretty focused discussion. I think it revolves around just a couple of issues. What role does government play in the development process? Obviously a pretty important one because specifically to the permitting process, it's about public health, safety, and welfare. And it doesn't exist outside of a context. The context being those codes that have been adopted over time. And, for those of you who know, zoning and particularly building codes have been around since the days of the pyramids. As a result of that concern about public health, safety, and welfare. And so, we've got a millennium of experience in trying to identify what that comprises. So we've got, the International Residential Code, we've got the UBC, we've got a variety of codes. Layered on top of that, plumbing, fire codes. You've also got, if depending upon the region you're in, related to earthquake, preparation. So there are a variety of codes that are out there. And the question, and the issue. So I brought this up when we talk about, as John said, we've been talking about housing. How do we encourage and incentivize housing? These are the ways that typically that pop up in just about every study and effort that's been identified. And so in this particular one, you see right at the very top, creating a streamlined entitlement process. Let's remove zoning from the discussion because that's really a different issue. What we're talking about with the application of these health and safety codes is how do you streamline a process that is a necessity and that continues to grow as our understanding of the risks tend to increase. So the purpose for doing that would be to reduce the risk to the developer, lower the financing costs because you're taking less time, and then of course faster delivery of the units. So I'm going to leave this up here for those of you who haven't been here. Welcome to Survivor, the public workshop series. There'll be adult beverages if you make it through this this session later. So I want to thank you for coming and get right into the subject. So let's start with the first question. How is the process working before the disaster? Because we need a baseline to start from. And since the disaster, we anticipate there's going to be a surge of building permits. But then, so all right, we throw more staff at it. But how well was it working before? And does the institution of additional requirements create more problems? So I'll tell you a quick story. In Colorado, we had a wildfire last Christmas, as a matter of fact, because the conditions were ripe in December for wildfires, destroyed 1,000 homes. So, these were relatively affluent population. So immediately, let's start rebuilding. Well, during that period of time, right before the fire, the municipalities had adopted new energy codes. All right, so now you push the cost up just a little bit there. Makes sense. We'd all say we need to use less energy. Immediately, they got pushback from the community. Hey, that's going to raise the cost. We just want to rebuild. We understand energy, but we just want to rebuild. We want to get back to where we were before as soon as possible. So what do you think the response was? Okay, well, we didn't really need those energy codes because we understand you're in a bad situation. So now they've deferred what was initially identified as a community desire, more resilience, better energy code. So in that kind of context, when we talk about streamlining the permitting process, where were we before? Where were you before? And where do you anticipate you'll be after this is over? Jump right in.
Okay. Let me just preface this with I'm the planning manager, but I am on a leadership team in Development Services Department. And as part of my gray skies roles is in recovery. So I dealt a lot with the post-disaster permitting. But I think our permitting situation was well known. I don't think I'm saying anything that nobody in the room knows, or if I am, well, we're about to learn. We had the city of Cape Coral had a transition to a new permitting system that occurred in February of 2022 that was particularly challenging for us. So we went into the storm in kind of a fix mode of our permitting system that we had implemented. We had significant delays in permitting at that time. And it wasn't just the new permitting system at all. We have unprecedented numbers of permits. Last year in 2022, we did 46,000 permits. And those were all types of permits, not just, everyone likes to talk about single family permits, but re-roofs, fences, all accessories, all of those. So we weren't having a great time prior to the storm. So, but we were well on our way to fixing the issues we had. And we did so kind of by our council really recognizing that our staffing levels weren't where they needed to be, specifically in our Development Services Department. And they took kind of really aggressive action to give us extra positions, more permitting techs, more plan reviewers, new types of plan reviewers to deal with zoning reviews, a deputy building official position. So we contracted out with some process improvement agencies. So while we weren't in our best position, we were getting better at that time, but it's been a rough go for a little bit, and the actual hurricane actually kind of made us have to switch again. So we are doing the best we can.
Of those things, which had the most impact?
I think actually what has had the most impact for us right now is actually kind of having that process improvement person who can look at the system as it was designed and really say, you know what, why are we doing it that way? The system can't handle it. Let's work the process. Let's change the process where we can use the system effectively. So for us, that was the biggest thing. The bodies is always great, but let's be honest, it's hard to hire. It's even hard to hire when you're offering benefits as well as, pension. It's still hard. So we still have open positions that we just cannot fill. And that's really been a challenge for us.
So it's a workforce problem? Okay, just making sure we.
Yeah.
So again, I'm going to preface this by saying prior to the storm, I had just come to the town months, less than a year prior to the storm. So I can't really speak to what it was previous. But when I showed up, I think we obviously had staffing issues, mainly in that, again, it's hard to hire. Especially when you're on a barrier island and most people are going to have to travel more than an hour to get there. I do personally, but I think most of our staff also has to come from outside the area. But I would say in my experience, a lot of our town's issues stem from a constant churn of the staff. We have a tough time perhaps holding on to some of that institutional knowledge, the historical knowledge. We are lucky to have some consulting help that does sort of bridge that gap. But for the most part, you just see a lot of churn in that area, whether it be just people retiring out of the system or being headhunted from other communities. it's tough to keep those people there. And it can be a little bit daunting when you have an entire team of developers across the table from you, and you kind of feel out on an island, pardon the pun. Making sure that you're not going to be taken advantage of, and the town's not going to be taken advantage of.
That last comment is a good one. You know, I've worked in and around government for a while, and the easiest thing for most government employees to say, no, because there's no risk. I'm not going to get yelled at. We're not going to do something that's going to be so radical or different that people are going to be bent out of shape as the result of it. And so getting to yes is a much harder thing to do from the public. You have people who are elected officials, other officials breathing down your neck, the community breathing down your neck. And so it's just so much easier to maintain the status quo. And I think that's a challenge that we have in these communities, is how do you push the envelope? How do you begin to, be proactive in these circumstances, Frank?
I want to chime in on this issue of churn. A few of us were having a conversation over lunch and about how frustrating it is from the developer side of the table that you're working your way through the process and then somebody from the staff leaves and you have a new staff person and we're going right back to start, right? It's not, we're 2/3 of the way through and we're not going backwards. We're going to keep going. We had this happen with a townhome development. The new permitting person who came in said, oh, I don't think townhomes should have front parking like that. The parking should be rear parking. So you're just gonna have to reconfigure the whole development. Yeah, because that's how it should be done. Can you please show us in the code where it's required? Well, I'm just saying that that's how the city now prefers that it be done. Okay, we're back to the drawing board. Thousands and thousands of dollars of new design work to be done. The same thing can happen occasionally with elected officials, right? That we've been through a cycle and now we have new folks who want to go back and revisit all the design choices that their predecessors chimed in on. So we've got to figure out how to ensure that we don't lose progress even when we have turnover on staff or on the commissions.
Thanks, Frank. And before we change gears, would love to hear from Sanibel, Benita, and Lee County, who are all on Zoom.
I'll go ahead and jump in. This is Craig Chandler from City of Sanibel, Planning Department. I'm not going to say anything that we haven't heard already, but from my perspective, it is a staffing issue predominantly. Having more people able to work at, and make progress at once is going to help. And we've had staffing issues, personnel issues, hiring challenges, all of the same things that have been raised already. Of course, Collaboratory's been speaking a lot towards housing affordability, and that's been a big issue for us as we try and bring in new staff. It's difficult to find places to live right now, especially after the hurricane, but it's certainly been that way in Southwest Florida for several years. And that's something that we're experiencing. And in addition to the challenges that we're experiencing with the new online permitting system, similar to Cape Coral, ours launched in August of 2021. And I'll be honest, things have been smoother in the last 6 months than they were in the 6 months following the launch of that permitting system. So that kind of, I think, emphasizes some of the challenges in the learning curve when you go from one way of doing things to another.
Thanks, Craig. Jacqueline?
Hello. So I too, I'm just with planning and zoning, but I deal for a small enough department where I'm very involved with the permitting department for the building side. And I would share too, we've had some turnover due to a variety of reasons. And we do agree that salary sometimes is one of those obstacles. We are a very small department. The city is a very government-like philosophy. We're very good at our inspections, but because we are such a small team, sometimes the intake and the plan review are a little bit longer than usual, but we don't have electronic plans fully implemented yet, which is sometimes might be a good thing from what I understand with some other jurisdictions that are kind of struggling with that. We do still accept a lot of hard copy submittals, which sometimes allows for those permits to get through the process a lot quicker than some of other jurisdictions that have full-blown e-permitting. So, and sometimes our residents really do appreciate that, especially because we do have an elderly population. But other than that, some of the same sentiments that the others have already shared.
It seems as though part of the challenge, even if you provide an electronic system to submit plans and reviews, someone still has to do the site inspections. I mean, and code, and as it relates to housing, code enforcement, you know, because there's affordable housing out there, but it's a quality affordable housing. So in addition to just sort of the plan review component, you've got the code enforcement flip side of it, as well as site inspections that go along with that whole process. I mean, has technology really shifted the table? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Audra, do you want to share from a Lee County perspective?
I think that those challenges that we're facing have already been discussed. We did have the advantage that we did our software conversion in 2018, which was a little bumpy, but by now we have all the kinks worked out, but we are facing the same challenges. We have staffing issues. We have just sheer volume issues. In March, we had 95% of our prior fiscal year volume. So there's just no function that's going to help to correct that until you can get the bodies in order to turn it over.
So does technology help? I mean, is that going to get you over the hump?
I think the technology helps. I don't think it's enough on its own, but we do have very effective in-house individuals working on our technology system that we've been able to do a substantial amount of automation since the storm hit. And it also does help that it helps our inspection site as well. We've got some virtual inspection processes in place. We've automated the issuance of our roof permits. We've automated the issuance of our demolition permits. So all of those automations do help, but there's still some that fail the checks that are built into the system to approve that automatic issuance. So then you're still having to have someone put eyes on those permits. So it does help, but it isn't an all-inclusive solution.
So I have a little bit of experience coming from another barrier island that had recently gone through a changeover in the system. And the one thing that always sticks with me is no matter what system you have, you end up having to have somebody dedicated to that. You need to have a liaison that can work with the group or the actual implementers on the side of the technology company. Also having less than clear understanding of what those ongoing costs are going to be. It all looks so great when you get the shiny trifold, but at the end of the day, you really have to have a 5 and 10 year vision about what's our storage going to be? What do we expect volumes to be in the worst possible scenario? And is that something that we're okay with spending the money to house that in the cloud exclusively or offsite? Or does it make more sense to invest in your own internal IT departments, set up your own mini server farm? The problem with technology is as soon as it becomes a bit more ubiquitous, everybody wants to start dropping everything in their phone and their computer into it. So you get tons and tons of pictures. If you allow for videos, people are going to find a way to shove videos in there that may or may not be relevant. And you got to figure out how to not only store that, but do you have a process to go in there and work with the technology company that you're leasing or purchasing that piece of software from to go in and sort of weed out some of that stuff? Do you have somebody at the absolute desk level in your office who understands the technology well enough to talk to the back end people? Have they been through enough problems with memory leaks and random other stuff that pops up? And can they speak the language of people to try and fix that and keeping that sort of institutional knowledge going as those people come out of your institution and you bring up new people in it?
That's internal. You've got people on the outside, architects, engineers, average homeowners who want to submit for the fence permit, you know, I mean, so there's that whole other side of understanding the technology well enough. Okay, it's there. How do I, you know, you know, what's the format I'm going to put in there? So you've got that in addition. You know,
So I have a clarifying question. Do all of the municipalities use the same software?
No.
Hmm. And I think we have a question in the chat from Sandy. So there's something there, especially when we have churn of what is possible by using similar systems.
Yes, also relevant to this conversation, Sandy Stillwell Youngquist, who is the branch lead for planning capacity. Could an inter-county or inter-municipality agreement be formed with Florida and or other states that have their same software for permitting? It might be the other counties who get hit in the future and we could help them. With it mostly done online now, it seems that this should work. Perhaps funding could help pay for this, then for inspections, outsource that, then eventually move toward having same software.
Thank you, Sandy.
yeah, let's see you go.
Me? Okay. Oh, I did have one right there. I wish I'm going to share some secondhand information, but I just learned about this last night. I normally wouldn't do that. And I do want to be careful because there's a specific company I'm going to mention that, and that's not what we're here for, is to advocate any products, but there are AI products out there to do plan review now. And actually during the break, I've got a conference call set up with them for next Thursday. I'm told, and this is secondhand, that they're using it in Pinellas County. I'm told it works very well. They believe it's probably going to improve the quality of their plan review. So I'm going to try to get some more information on that, but I'm just curious if any of you heard of these products or aware of them.
No,
Heard of, haven't interacted with anybody that's using it.
And to maybe follow up on Gary's comment, that it might not only improve it, but expedite the process, which is what's important. I have a couple of comments to make on this because I'm very involved in the permitting process and in the construction industry. And I want to preface my comments by saying the staff in all these building departments are doing a tremendous job considering the load that they're currently under. You know, the numbers that we're seeing going through the permitting departments are just record numbers by all accounts. Tens of thousands of permits that they have to deal with, everything from, as was mentioned by Amy, a fence permit to, you know, a new house or a high rise or whatever they have to deal with. But some of the real life examples and cases that I've seen recently, one of them was in Cape Coral when right after the hurricane, there was a tremendous need to issue roofing permits and re-roofing permits. So what did they do? They went to paper over the table, over the counter permit down at the cultural center, opened up a little annex there, and they were pumping those permits out. Very reminiscent of the days past where you go to the counter and get a permit right over the counter that day. It was a great move on part of the city. They had tens of thousands of permits or roofs to repair, and they issued a bunch of them. I forget what the last number was, but it was an incredibly high number, like 40,000 roofing permits that have been issued over there. With regard to Fort Myers Beach, recently we made an effort to try to modify one of the ordinances there to allow staff a little bit more authority in granting some administrative variances, because we have issues down there of non-conforming lots that do not meet today's standards or regulations. And it made a whole lot of sense to let staff make some of these administrative calls instead of having to go through the process of getting a full-blown variance for a setback. So right now that unfortunately didn't make it through the final hearing by town council and they voted it down, but it has just done nothing but slow the process down and make it more difficult for the people to rebuild down there. You know, the emphasis and the talk on the beach, including by town council who turned it down, was that they wanted to rebuild the beach and wanted to have it have the same character it had years ago. It's not going to be that way. We all know that. But at least there would have been maybe some efforts to restore some housing back to similarly what it was. This is just a roadblock, and it's now dragged this process out. So people who are interested in rebuilding and trying to recapture some of that vibe that's down there on the beach, they're losing that opportunity because as time goes on, two things are happening. The cost is getting higher, and those opportunities of rebuilding are going away because there's other people who are taking advantage of the opportunities down there and trying to amass properties and build bigger structures, high rises, condos, whatever, which is again going to defeat the whole purpose of trying to rebuild this beach community. So that was not a staffing issue. That was purely a political, the town council made that ultimate decision. But it's a real life example of some of the obstacles that we're overcoming. Lastly, in Lee County, and we just had a meeting to discuss permitting issues just yesterday, and the numbers and the times that Lee County is dealing with are exceptionally high. The turnaround time for a permit is almost 3 months. But what we found was that an owner builder has the opportunity to submit a paper application over the counter. That process eliminates close to a month of time. But yet a builder who's compelled to use the electronic filing system is actually, it's costing us more time. So there's obviously a disconnect there. I'm old school. I'm not a big computer person. I love the old paper process. I've been doing this for a lot of years. But, we're always told, hey, electronic submittals, it's going to expedite the process. It's going to make the process quicker and better, and truly have yet to really see the results of that. But these are things that if we're looking at this process, and I do agree, it's not just the process, but it is personnel. We got to get people in there to process all the paperwork, because as it was discussed at Lee County yesterday, it's all good and well that you get all these things uploaded, but who's going to look at them? You still need all those people to look at that thousands and thousands of permits that are coming across the desk. Maybe there's opportunities to look at that process in conjunction with adding additional staff and find ways of eliminating or streamlining some of the processes. Another example of that is when several months back before the hurricane, we were talking about a backlog of screen enclosure permits. Screen enclosures are just like a house. They're an engineered structure. When you apply for a screen enclosure permit, it comes with raised seal engineering, which for screen enclosure, that's pretty much over the top. I mean, it's a screen enclosure. Yeah, we don't want it to blow down in a storm, but it's just a screen enclosure. So the other part of that was zoning, having to check and make sure the setbacks are accurate and that, it's going back where it needs to go. For the most part, we don't build screen enclosures just out in the middle of a yard. They're usually on a porch or on a pool deck. So when the pool permit is applied for, usually those things are checked. But to the credit of Lee County, the building official did decide, well, you know what, that makes good sense. Let's expedite screen enclosure permits because they do carry an engineer seal. And really what we just need to look at is make sure the setbacks are correct and let's get it out. And they had, I can't even remember the number, but it was also thousands of permits that were tied up in screen enclosures that they were able to then turn around and then quickly expedite and get those out of the backlog, because that's part of that total cumulative number of permits, and if it's 10 or 10,000, it's that many less that they have to contend with. So it's a combination of getting good people, which is a challenge in the construction industry right now. It's like pulling hen's teeth to trying to get good employees. And Lee County and City of Fort Myers, town of Fort Myers Beach, Cape Coral, Sanibel, they're all competing for the same building inspectors and qualified plan reviewers. It's a joke that they're out there, obviously competing with each other and up in the bid every time they get a chance to lure one from the other departments, other municipalities. So it's a struggle for them to get them. They got to find them and then they got to train them before they can let them really work on their own. So that's not just a few days or a few weeks. It's a months and months long process to get these people up and running. So while we're doing that, adding staff, we need to definitely look at the process and figure out whether it's an AI solution that can do plan review in seconds versus days, or streamline the process and eliminating things that are redundant or not necessary. It's something that we really need to look at to solve this problem.
So before you, Amy, I know you have some great ideas. Before we jump in, so there's an opportunity to maybe start to identify what permits can be streamlined, and maybe to your point, Gary, AI might play a role in those, especially that can be streamlined, that may not need an individual. We know we need some sort of, like, this has been a conversation for a while. Gary, you've been part of this, a sector strategy for workforce related to the construction industry, which all of this conversation is related to the construction industry. I think it came up in one of the other conversations this week. I don't remember, but there is this ongoing conversation of what is the sector strategy for construction, the construction industry specifically, and that would include municipal plan review, that would include community development departments, that would include those sorts of things of how do we solve for that. And if automation is part of it, then let's figure out the automation that would help with that. Gary?
One more comment, and maybe if I can get some feedback from the building officials, I appreciate it. I've been lobbying with Associated Builders and Contractors in Tallahassee every year for the last 15 plus years. And every year we go up there and ask for some consistency from municipality to municipality in the permitting process. And every year we're at the throats of the League of Cities because they don't want that. And I get it, home rule. But I'm just going to point out, when we are in this situation, I will say this, Southwest Florida is one of the best places in terms of having user-friendly departments. If you go over to the East Coast to the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, my God. So that's a compliment, but it would help if there was more consistency from a contractor's point of view in the way we go through a permitting process, because we do have to learn that. And we'd love to see you guys work together, maybe to create a little more consistency to make it easier for us.
Are you suggesting something along the lines of maybe some of the permits are universal permitting applications or universal
It's really-
process?
It's really
or
about the application and the process. And, and also about the cost. Senator Perry, who owns a roofing company in Gainesville, will tell you a story about bidding a roof replacement on 2 Walmarts that were prototypes, 2 exact same buildings. And in Southeast Florida, the cost for the permit was 2.5 times the cost of a permit in Ocala. And by state statute, you're not allowed to charge any more than it costs you to. So again, these are the types of things you see where they're using the permitting process, I think, as an impediment to development. And again, it doesn't happen locally, thank goodness, but it does happen in some jurisdictions.
Is part of, going back to the basis for zoning, but certainly building permits, the public health, safety and welfare, how much of this revolves around insurance and liability? Because the whole, the issues, back in another life, I was a program administrator for the state licensing boards, engineers, architects, land surveyors, etc. And the vocabulary was really about liability, because if something, if the screen blows off and hits someone, then, well, what was the fasteners? Who approved it? So how much of this gets into that whole risk aversion component, which is what insurance really is all about? So, now that we're better, more resilient issues, how do you think that plays into this, Gary?
Well, I would not have tied what I was talking about and what Richard was talking about. I think we as contractors have that risk liability. I don't think the city or the municipalities have any of
Oh,
that.
yeah. Oh, yeah. If they approve,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. If they approve, if the spec, that's why they do site inspections. They come out and do foundation. Yeah, they have.
I haven't seen that, but I'll take your word for it because I know they do come after us because I think ultimately we are responsible. But I understand, you're right. If they were to be negligent, completely negligent, provably negligent, you're probably right.
Well, and I'm sure you've seen these situations at least. Something fails in a building. I'm thinking about Honolulu. The contractor, the developer, to save money, went and replaced a lot of the piping with PVC. And so as soon as they pressurized the water system, it blew, flooded floors. And so now the contractors point at the developer's pointing at the architect saying, well, building inspection approved it. They got their COs. So, it becomes a mess. So, but from your experience, that's not
the issue I described, I think, is is when elected officials use their building department to create NIMBYism is what I
Okay.
believe is the root cause. But again, I do hear your point. There's some liability there. And you do want, I mean, we want things built to standards. Certainly, we don't want to reduce standards.
I think though that we should be careful when we're talking about what is, you know, preservation of life and safety and what are aesthetic standards. Because we talk about building code and permitting as if everything somebody's life depends on. And we went through this with City of St. Pete 5 or 6 years ago to say, you're asking us to build affordable housing, but then you have this requirement and that requirement and this requirement and that, which are aesthetics. None of this is about safety. And you're adding 10% out of the cost of a house, which is in essence, you're saying this many people are out of the home ownership pool now, right? Because they can't afford that extra 10% jump in cost. You've already capped your subsidy program, so that's what we can do. Is that really, really necessary, right? And I think the same thing when we talk about our permitting process, right? You know, can we reconsider what we actually need from a safety perspective and what we just absolutely have to have from an aesthetics perspective? Because we treat this as a given, as if I should be allowed to chime in on what my neighbor's house looks like. But nobody calls up their neighbor and says, I don't like the car that you just bought. You need to take that back or paint it another color. Like, that's completely ludicrous. But we feel just fine to go to the city council and say, she's trying to build this house next to me and I don't like the window choices.
Amy, I know you've been patiently waiting. Thank you.
Well, no, I was just going to jump in on that. And I would just say, you know, I think the legislature actually did address that with their move that preempts local governments from any sort of architectural requirements on 1 and 2 family units. So that was a good move, I think, on their part to help with that particular issue.
Acknowledging we have folks on Zoom. Any comments from Sanibel, Lee County, or Bonita Springs?
So I wanted to take a step back to this concept of the AI review. I think so. AI is obviously in its sort of infancy in its use in the wider public. I think there's probably a place for something like that when we talk about building codes and applying those codes. You've got a population of codes and books that are finite, and it's either right or wrong. You're using the right fastener, or you're not using the right fastener, right? I would be very afraid when we start talking about implementing that in the planning side. And that's only because when you have been in a planning position, you realize that the words on the page are only half of the story. What you really have is a whole codex of administrative understandings and local flavor that go along with how to do things. And from a staff level position, the effort to try and keep precedents consistent. You don't want, because one new person came in, an entirely radical reinterpretation of the code. And I say that because realistically, there are a lot of administrative understandings about how we do things and about what those terms mean, these planning and land development codes and how they're applied locally, that can't be reproduced from town to town, because it oftentimes comes down to, well, how did we interpret this before? What's our precedence from the town council? How did they interpret this code language? So it's harder for, I think, AI to really get into that, because you're going to end up feeding them some people's marginalia notes. You're going to be feeding them hours and hours of town council meetings or M&P meetings, things that are just not easily codified as you are going to use a red head to, put this thing in the ground and keep it there. So I take your point. I think we do need to try and leverage the technology, but I think we need to be very careful about looking at it as somehow the sort of panacea and the key to unlock what we believe our problems are going to be. There's still room for the human condition. There's still room for people to faithfully try and apply the codes with an understanding of what those codes have meant and will mean going forward in the local community.
Going back to the kind of cross-jurisdictional discussion, I think there is some value in having a discussion about how each of us permit different types of things. So if someone's saying, I can get a push button permit in Cape Coral for a fence replace, but I can't in another jurisdiction, like there's an opportunity to say, okay, why are they doing it that way? And why can't we do it that way? And sometimes you're going to find that there's a reason why you can't issue that type of permit, that something that's unique to your community that may not be in another. For us, we converted a good number of permits to push button, but then we had to, in some cases, walk it back because we're like, you know what? There's a reason why we were actually reviewing that permit, because we have a very strict burrowing owl ordinance, and we have a very strict bald eagle ordinance. The other thing with push button permitting that also is something you have to really take a look at is, what are your floodplain regulations, right? And I think you're going to find that, push button permits are great, but if it leads to you violating your own floodplain ordinance by saying, not being able to look if it's substantial damage occurred and things like that. So no, don't just think about churning permits out. Think also about what are the other regulations that you could potentially be violating that you didn't know you were.
So there's a building officials association of course. Asking the question, how do they interact, and does that provide the opportunity for collaboration? There's a building code officials association of Florida. How do they interact with local communities? I assume they're made up of local communities. And does that provide an opportunity to begin talking about some level of standardization?
Yeah, they do meet on a regular basis as a group of building officials, and it's to discuss, uniform interpretation for the most part. Maybe not so much implementation, but, hey, this is the way the code reads and this is what I understand it to mean. Maybe to kind of piggyback on Amy's comments there with regards to what you were saying, Amy, about rolling things back after you maybe make a decision like that. I think what would be helpful for the industry would be for the building departments to explain that, why they're doing that. A lot of times we have no idea whatsoever why all of a sudden you've reversed a previous decision. The industry has been working for years for uniformity, and in earlier versions of the building code, it was prescribed that there would be uniformity, so that my company, I work in 5 or 6 different jurisdictions. Every one of them has a different application and a different application process and requirement for information. So it's extremely burdensome and stressful, particularly for my staff, because they got to remember, okay, this one wants it this way, this one wants it that way. You get a lot of rejections because of that you may not necessarily get if you had a uniform process. Sandy Stillwell Youngquist was speaking to that, I think, was that, let's have a uniform process. We would love to see that as an industry, but for some reason there's pushback on that. It may have to do with the programs they're using, trying to get all municipalities to use one program. I don't know if that creates some sort of a monopoly situation, maybe some antitrust laws involved in there or something, but certainly would be beneficial to the community at large and the builders specifically to have that, but we don't. It's very burdensome. I think to the AI side of this, not so much maybe planning issues, but just plan review, to look at maybe AI streamlining plan review, because plan review for the most part, either it's it's in the code and that's what you're conforming and applying the code, or you're not. It is kind of black and white. We've always argued for years that it really shouldn't be black and white, although it's written right there in specific terms in black and white. We always argue that we're trying to meet the intent of what the code is. We want homes that are strong. We don't want them blowing apart. We do want them energy efficient. We want them built to the right elevation. Those have all come to pass to show that they're working very well. Houses that are built to today's standards, the right elevation and to the code, performed exceedingly well. But to an earlier question about the insurance industry and the role they play, quite honestly, they drive the car. Okay. Just a few years ago, there was an implementation of what they call freeboard, which is a total circumvention around FEMA. FEMA didn't change their elevations, but the building code adopted an additional foot above freeboard or above the base foot elevation called freeboard. Totally under the radar, totally surprised the industry, weren't prepared for it. Behind the scenes, the insurance lobby was driving that car because they want to get houses up higher. Now, you know, whether it's needed or not, well, I think it bore out in some cases here in Lee County that that extra foot of freeboard might have made the difference, but it's expensive. You know, a foot of fill on a typical house can be $10,000. So that additional fill doesn't come for free. There's cost. And what we're always concerned about is the cost versus the benefit. What are we getting for what additional costs we're incurring due to these stricter standards? Energy efficiency is ramping up every year. It gets more difficult every year to pass the energy code. And the end results of that is unintended consequences. We now have problems with air quality inside a home because they're too well sealed.
Right.
So now we're talking about sick homes because they're not breathing at all. Matter of fact, houses, you know, where we're using isonine spray foam insulation or whatever brand you may use, we have to introduce fresh air into the house to compensate for that fact that the house is too well sealed and it can't breathe. It seems counterintuitive that we'd want to drag hot, humid air into the system, but that's how it works, and it works well. But you know, there's these unintended consequences that come from some of these things, and more importantly, it affects the bottom line and affordability, which is what we were talking about in earlier sessions. So, you know, it's a complicated topic, and it deserves a lot more attention than it gets, unfortunately.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. For those communities that use community development block grant disaster recovery funds, there are additional regulations in the consolidated notice that require multiple, you know, check boxes for energy efficiency. Obama administration passed the freeboard requirement requiring 1 foot elevation above, you know, FEMA identified floodplain elevation. That's in, you know, if you want to use this money, you know, accessibility, ADA code. I mean, so pretty much at every level, federal level, state level, local level, you're getting a combination of pushes and pulls on the system. So if you never adopted that, if you want to use these dollars, you know, a dollar in, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound.
But the code was always supposed to be a minimum code.
Right.
Not a maximum code. And what has become, it's become a maximum code.
Right.
And for that reason, you know, if you want to access these particular programs or funds, you have to maximize what you're doing, which just costs more. It's kind of counterintuitive of what they want to do. Years ago, the Lee County Electric Co-op had a program called the Good Sense Energy Program, and people could elect to do things, additional things to their homes to make them more energy efficient. And it was a cost versus benefit. You could clearly show the people for X number of extra dollars to do insulation or do other things like higher SEER ratings on air conditioning systems. You could see a direct connection with the payback in energy savings. Your electric bill is going to go down X number of dollars a month if you do these improvements. And we could rationalize that by saying that savings, you're going to recoup that expense in 5 years or less, which made sense because most people don't live in their homes for more than maybe 7 years on average. Nowadays, that gap is gone. There's no more, hey, I want to upgrade these things and get these benefits, because the regulation is slowly ratcheted up. So now that program is gone. They don't have it anymore because it was just a situation where the minimum standard became the maximum.
So apply that to multifamily housing, where you're a renter in a building, you know, whatever value might have accrued from energy savings, depending upon how the utilities are structured in the rental building, don't go to the renter. You know, if you add solar panels, that value doesn't go to the renter. You've made the building more resilient. That value doesn't go to the renter. And the question, you know, in terms of how the formula looks, how long, the developer holds on to it and flip. When you apply those same issues to multifamily housing, it becomes an even more difficult because now you've added the cost. And then the question becomes who achieves the value out of that additional cost that you've now, put into that structure. And so as it relates to multifamily housing and building and the permitting process, because that's a lot of this discussion, how does that, is there any impact there? So far, we've talked a lot about single family homes. That's kind of an easy one. But as it relates to multifamily homes and the desire to build, multi-unit structures, how does this discussion wrap into that?
I cannot speak to that, but I so wish Diana was still here. She could, because she wears all of those hats. And what I want to do is, I don't want to go down these multiple rabbit holes, even though this is like my jam. I love all this, right? But the task on hand is to look at streamlining the permitting process and how we can provide solutions in the context of housing. So we've gone through a major pandemic. We've gone through a hurricane that we've never seen the flooding before. It gives us many opportunities to look at the context of fire, building code. It looks at base floor elevation, whether we build or not in the coastal high hazard, whether there's insurance, all of these things. We're talking about all these things. But today, in order to provide solutions, whether it be within a jurisdiction or whether it be regionally, we're looking to cut out the red tape, the time that it takes to move a permit forward. So if we're coming back to the conversation at hand, I know we've had a question, and I think the answer is yes, a regional permitting process would be interesting to entertain. We have to figure out maybe something like AI could help us do a surface review of whether it's in an overlay, whether it files in the coastal high hazard, whether it is within the construction line, of development, whether it is in an agricultural area that now is being rezoned for housing. And now we have to figure out where we're getting our food from. Don't make me go down the rabbit hole of food systems. Okay. And I'd have to put on my ag hat and my extension hat, and we're not going to do that. But I will tell you, looking at a big purview of this, I think there is opportunity to have a regional permitting system. It's the weeds of how do you store the digital files, the paper files, where's the historical context? If you have a different permitting system in Bonita versus City of Fort Myers or Sanibel, you have a workforce development problem because people have to understand how to use every one of those different softwares. The softwares can't talk to each other. GIS has an issue. Yes, we can visibly map and tell stories across the board about the outcomes, the impacts, where we're going, where we've been. But the process is looking at how can we regionally reduce the permitting process, not only for development, but for the plan reviewers, the zoners, and the people designing the automation of the integral layers that have to go through that permit coming across the board. So I want to just try to get us back to that discussion of, with the experts that are in the room or online, or those of us who have experienced what it's like to be doing plan review, then going to an online system, then going to e-permitting, right? I mean, Amy, Jackie, Audra, my mentor when it came to zoning. These are the things we need to kind of figure out, what can we do within a systems perspective to automate things, to reduce the time in things that we have control with.
And Jen made a really good point, as we really ought to stay on the subject of how to move the for the attainable hat, and particularly the donut hole that we're trying to. But I do want to make one point that the Florida Building Code was written for two reasons. In the 1990s, it was written because Andrew proved to us that we had an inadequate code, and because the Florida legislature wanted consistency throughout the state of Florida, and the insurance industry wanted consistency throughout. And it was written that way. It was passed in 98, I think. I served on the Florida Building Commission for 7 years. The intent was one code. Now, and you're right, I think certainly city councils and they have purview over aesthetics, landscaping, those kinds of things, but there's one code. And even to do a local amendment, you have to go through the Florida Building Commission, and locally, we don't have any. Miami-Dade has a bunch and some other municipalities have them, but it's one code. It really, the space is in the development order process, the planning side for non-building issues, which is why I started the day saying our buildings, if they're built to the code, to Richard's point, it's a solid code. It is those other things that are going to allow us to move the ball forward, I think.
As a builder of, I was a builder of affordable homes, and nowadays I don't know what can be affordable at the prices we have to pay for materials and labor. But how can we, I'm not a nonprofit builder, so I don't see those benefits of the streamlining of affordable housing permitting. And so I'm not actually knowledgeable about exactly what that means to somebody that is recognized as an affordable housing builder. But how can we incorporate, like I've been left out in the cold there, and with this permitting taking so long, there's absolutely no way I can agree to, certain contracts, because when you're pricing something for somebody that's in $300,000 range, they can't afford a $25,000 increase. If it takes you 6 months to get a permit, now you say, oh, okay, we're ready to build now, but now the cost is this, and they can't afford it. So I've literally lost viable people that were wonderful and deserved a home, but I couldn't build it for them because by the time I got a permit, and literally I went through the process, and then when I adjusted my pricing and said, gosh, as much as I want to do this for you, I can't pull money out of my own pocket to build your home. So what can we do to, what are the processes? What does your municipality do for affordable housing and expediting permitting? And how can we, look at affordable housing and help that, that area out to get better permitting applications pushed through?
I'm going to say something that the building industry may not appreciate. Most of the time, when we turn down a permit, it's because we got bad packages. We got incomplete packages. We got somebody who's on the job for a couple weeks only and missed something. We get arguments about why do we have to give a stamped stormwater plan. Let's not get on the subject of water management districts and what they do and don't do and how useful they are. Lord help me, I hope they're not listening to this. But I think the point that we're making is, in my experience, we went from weeks and weeks and weeks of trying to get permitting rolling as quickly as possible pre-storm. Our new building official basically just said, no, we're gonna do these turnarounds in one day. You're going to review it in one day. That's a question of, do you have enough staff members to actually pick that up? If not, you're going out and you're getting consultants or outside groups to do that review for you. But again, my experience coming into it is that there's very little, there isn't enough pre-meeting with the communities that needs to be done. And I know you guys don't want to send somebody for a pre-application meeting for a single family home or any number of projects, but there's a lot of people that will submit packages that they think are right because it passed in another community. And when it gets to us, we don't have the capacity at the staff level to be as flexible as you want us to be, because you're asking people that are making $15 to $20 an hour, maybe, to go out on a limb and say, well, this makes sense. It makes this go quicker, but what's the outcome if it fails or if it doesn't mesh with the understanding of the elected officials? And I become the whipping boy for this. So maybe you're going to go back to the point. We really do need to sort of figure out regionally, how do we consolidate our information? What you should be able to walk into a community and say, I know that I need to give a site plan that includes an aerial view. I know I need to give a ferment for that lot. That is where we tend to fall down.
Well, one of the problems is you change the rules and how do you notify people that you've changed the rules? If we didn't have building industry associations, nobody would know there was any change in rules. Now, for people who aren't members of those organizations, you don't know the rules change until you do a submittal and they say, oh, you're rejected for this. Oh, when did that change? Oh, that changed, you know. So that's part of the problem.
So keep us back on solutions focused. So I think there's this opportunity and it came up, John Talmadge brought it up. So we have all of these opportunities where we can inform essentially the business community on changes in processes and things like that. So let's take the building industry as an example. You know, as a builder or as a developer, you have to have, if you're located within the city of Cape Coral or Lee County, you have to have some sort of business license. There are opportunities without being part of associations to inform those entities and those organizations. So there is a piece there. I think there is this opportunity. So to your point, these are folks making $15 to $20 an hour, maybe. On the front, they're the front lines of a plan review. There is this opportunity. Maybe that is where we leverage technology in AI or whatever it might be to do that initial like immediate rejection if you forgot to submit XYZ. That happens the moment you click the button. It's like you forgot these 4 things. And so I think those are some of the opportunities that we're talking about, the solutions that we're trying to get to, and what does that investment look like as a community, as a county, to ultimately create a model that does start to offset some of these things that are complaining. I mean, I would love, like, and we don't need to answer this today, but I would love to know, like, what is the number one reason that an initial permit is rejected? What doesn't matter, like, let's say a new single family home. What is the number one reason that it is kicked back immediately? You said they forget to submit a site map or they, whatever those things might be. Like, what are those things that AI would actually probably, or some technology solution would actually help catch, you know, out of the gate?
So I think that's going to be kind of dependent on the locality. And that goes back to making regional checklists of things that everybody can agree on they need to get, that every community needs. But, you know, I would say the biggest issue that we run into where stuff immediately fails, it's signatures in the right place. It's these state requirements that we have to, you know, have this thing notarized 3 times on this form. And we've sidestepped some of that post-storm. Our building officials done just yeoman's work trying to streamline this stuff. And again, we're getting initial reviews done within 24 hours. That is perhaps not sustainable without a real increase in staff. But I think it could be done. I think the state really needs to go back to a little bit of the drawing board and figure out what's really important. I'm sure there's reasons why we need 3 notarizations on any given form, particularly, or why owner builders can't be in LLCs. You know, there's reasons for it, I'm sure, but maybe we need to reassess from 30 years ago whether we're really scared of that happening again, or if we've got new strategies to solve those problems.
I think Gary has a response to that, and then Amy, I want to get.
It's very quick. I'm chuckling because that is exactly the fact that what you just said is accurate. It's usually a process problem, which is exactly why we would like to see the same process in every municipality. But unfortunately, every municipality reads the law, which was written by lawyers, and I'll stop myself from making a comment. And then they interpret it and make up their own unique form to meet that requirement. That's why we wanted consistency.
Oh, yeah. You know, one of the municipalities here, I won't name them, but they have their own notice of commencement form that's different than everybody else's. And if you don't use that form, they're not going to accept it. It's a notice of commencement. Okay.
Right. So we have some things that we can automate, notice of commencement being one. So Amy, you have.
I was just going to say, you know, I think from these storms, we actually can learn a little bit and start to ask those questions. One of the things that we recognized was a challenge for our backlog was having to put eyes on every NOC, right? That we had a backlog of like 3,500, don't quote me on that, staff, if you're watching, like 3,500 NOCs, and we had to open up every single one of them. And our attorneys were like, you have to open up you have to put your eyes on every one. So what we did was we reached out to the governor's office and we just said, hey, can you guys consider, putting something in the executive order that allows us to not have to put our eyes on this every time. We're going to take it for what it is. And, this will immediately get rid of a huge backlog for us. And they were very receptive to it. And so taking that one step further and saying, okay, after the storm, after we get over this permitting issue, is that something that we need to change all the time? Like not just in the disaster declaration. Is that something we can bring forward? So there's an opportunity there.
That's a perfect example.
So this is great. And what I would love to, yes, and I would love, to take this conversation. So we have a general idea of what makes sense on the streamline side for pieces and parts of this. So I think there should be, or maybe there's an opportunity for a dialogue here around, like, what are the steps to get there? That's what we're talking about. So if we're building a solution, it's not just automate everything, AI is the answer, woohoo. It's like, what are the steps that we need to take to get there in order for us to make that? I think what you did as a disaster declaration, how do we make that the actual thing that we do across all the municipalities, right? Like different NOCs, and like, what are all of these little steps that we can start to work through, and what are those solutions that we can establish? And are there other places that have already done this that we can recreate or build off of their model that they have? Jen?
Is it Jason? Okay, I just want to highlight again and make sure it's it's underlined and highlighted, the importance of a pre-application meeting. And again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to go back to my context here because that's what I always do. Yes, the savings may not be there for a single family builder, occupied person to go through and get a pre-application meeting because it's pretty simple of what you need to do to meet the threshold. But I want to emphasize, and Jackie, I know you're there, but one of the things that we were able to do is cut down our permitting time in Bonita by having required pre-application meetings with developers or bigger projects. And we had fire there, we had building there, we had zoning there. At the time, I was the bike ped coordinator. I was there, and we were able to handle those questions at the forefront, which saves dollars and questions at the back end. So I just want to make sure that the importance, and every municipality has the potential for a pre-application meeting. In the last session, we discussed the importance of having perhaps a government liaison for public policy, right? Or things of that nature. It might behoove developers or bigger multifamily units to have someone that's familiar with not only the planning and zoning and regulations, but also how to automate the permitting process from the developer's side. So I just want to throw that out there.
So I'm sorry. So I have a comment and then a question. So a couple of communities I've worked in for major projects, we had exactly that. We had, we met with all the building officials, department heads. We had a handful of major projects that were going on across the city. We'd sit down and talk through each one of them. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? So I think that model has been done and works. Then the second is a question, because I hear this about the staffing and training. So my background is in architecture. I was fortunate that I'd worked on building sites, but many of the architects I worked with had never been to a building site. And so, even understanding how to put together drawings, they didn't understand line weights or the importance of that. Building official. So is training another component of this? Pretty much at every level. I know the Building Official Association, at least in Colorado and that region, got together and did training all the time with developers and builders and subs. So is training another part of it, from A to Z, all the people involved in the building process? Could they improve their level of intellectual capacity that would make this better?
I would love to hear from our jurisdictions, how many of us measure and then publicly report, like on a website, what our permitting times are for each of the steps of the process. Because, I go back to Peter Drucker's wisdom, right? What gets measured is what gets managed.
I know that, again, disclaimer, permitting isn't my division, but I know we have to, by law, have to do our permitting permit utilization report has to be posted on your website on a monthly basis. As far as wait times, I don't know if that's part of what has to be posted or not. But the numbers certainly are, and all the charts.
Statutory requirements for timeframes for issuing permits, which I don't believe any municipalities in Southwest Florida are meeting currently.
Yeah, for single family, you have to have everything out by 30 days.
So Jen, you had shared that Sanibel had changed. If you could speak to that a little bit, and then Craig would love your response to what Jen shared with us.
And I'm paraphrasing a different approach that the city of Sanibel has done is they have started differentiating the silos of their departments and doing more of a holistic approach. So instead of having your building department, your zoning department, your planning department, you have a, comprehensive department where you have people that have multi-understanding of the different aspects that can make the process go smoother. And again, it's automating, but automating with understanding the regulations that come into play. And Amy, you can probably kind of speak to that a little bit from planning perspective.
And I was going to say actually, and then even take it a step further, where you have all of those departments working so closely together. But oftentimes your housers are outside of those departments. So we're a little bit luckier in Cape Coral because our housing staff are within our planning department. And so that in and of itself is helpful to be able to have that cross dialogue between different divisions, even though the building code is the building code. We regularly interact with our plans examiners. They come to our planners and talk about zoning issues. So it's having that cross collaboration extremely important for development services departments.
Great, thanks. Craig, did you want to touch on that from Sanibel's perspective?
Yeah, I'll follow up. I don't want to pretend like we don't have an advantage being a smaller community. I do think the fact that we do work in close proximity with one another. We do have smaller departments than other municipalities do, generally speaking. So we have opportunities to work together, maybe more so than in other places. Definitely do stress pre-application meetings. We try and involve all departments at that stage so that applicants are getting the feedback that they need to hear as early as possible. And that's definitely something that we're continuing to emphasize as we go through in the wake of Hurricane Ian. And the only other thing I'll mention, now there have been some advantages to having concurrent reviews. Although I will admit we have had some negative feedback on the downsides of concurrent reviews. So right now an applicant would have to prepare a full engineered construction set to have an application that's deemed complete for review. And again, this is where the pre-application meeting can become a very important step. It gives us an opportunity to maybe look at these concept plans, site plans before sending things to an engineer to do the final set. But we no longer have these staged reviews. And there has been, I think, a little bit of a pushback on that from the builders. They've obviously accepted the new way of doing things, but it hasn't been without bumps. I will say that.
Gary?
Kind of change gears a little bit, so we don't get too stuck on, to get back to your point of the multifamily, which is probably going to help us solve our problem a little more quickly than some of the single family discussion. More often than not in commercial, which most of the multifamily falls under the commercial code, more often than not, the problem is not the building official, it's the fire official. And they're not at the table today. So that's maybe a follow-up for us there. And there's a good reason for it. The fire official generally reports to, I guess, the fire marshal of the state of Florida, and there's really not a lot of accountability there. And there's 3 words that lead to this that unfortunately is repeatedly used in FPA, which is in the opinion of the authority having jurisdiction. So they have a lot of power to just use their judgment. And I do know safety is important, so I'm not belittling it. I'm just saying it becomes a huge problem, and it may be something we should address before we're finished with our work here.
It's a great point, Gary. And I think, similar to other things that have been discussed, the fire code isn't actually a code. It's, based on, it's a safety standard. And so, but it is applied as a code across communities and it's interpreted differently. So I do think there is a need to include, that's a great call out, to include the, we have the fire district as part of the recovery
districts are
task force.
represented on the
Yep.
bigger task force.
And they're on many of the branches. And so I think there's an opportunity to pull them into this conversation of streamlining processes, especially around multifamily and mixed use, where they will play a bigger role compared to single family.
Yeah, and I think we lost all of our multifamily builders. I would love to hear if.
No, he's just tired. He's been here all week, so he doesn't want to. He doesn't have
Mixed use.
mixed use, Dan.
I'll just chime in quickly on what Gary's saying, because, another observation. I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned it, but the fire marshals that I know mostly came up out of the fire service, right? They're not builders by trade. They were a deputy chief or an assistant chief or something, and this is another step up the career ladder until a chief position opens up somewhere. So we're asking people to take on, responsibility for a piece of the building work who really have no background in that. And that's a really fascinating bottleneck you brought up. Definitely something that we should be looking at fast tracking.
Well, that's why I'm going to go back to the training component. I mean, overall, not just within that specialty,
And
but
d-
across fields.
Does anyone know, does BOAF have training for the building officials? Because I think BOAF does have some, but I don't know if it's continuing education type stuff. But yeah, so that's not really training. That's sort of a check the box thing, unfortunately.
Make sure that there is some capturing of this idea of part of a what could potentially be a sector strategy around the construction industry. It's this all encompassing. It also includes things like building officials. It also includes things like fire departments and fire marshals. It also includes things like developers. It also includes things. So this is a multi-pronged approach for the entire, beginning to end of the construction sector or the building sector. That there's a strategy in there somewhere around how we would get there. Jason.
So I wanted to dovetail on one issue and then perhaps shift gears on something I'd been thinking about this week in preparation for this meeting. I would love to have a sit down discussion on the pros and cons of concurrent review at the staff level. I see the benefits of concurrent review versus having a gatekeeper before it sort of opens up to a wider review. My experience has been that planning and zoning tends to be the gatekeeper model in as much as if you fail on setbacks or you fail in something else on your site plan, it tends to affect the building envelope or the physical building itself. So there's no real good reason to all of a sudden have everybody else review something if, oops, you're off by a foot on your setback and you've got to go back and re-engineer trusses, start talking about, does the homeowner really want to have that room on that side of the building anymore if they've got to lose a foot? So again, I don't know if today we can solve the world's planning problems of concurrent review or not, but I think it's an interesting discussion to have and see if there's a hybrid model somewhere in there that does work. To shift gears just briefly though, and one thing that I've run into after the storm, substantial damage estimation. The state of Florida, who I will say I used to work for in their floodplain management program, did yeoman's work. They did a really good job working with FEMA, coming up with this idea of having a substantial damage estimator. Nobody knows how to use it except for the state people. They're willing to send folks down to you that have used it in local communities after a storm, but there's not a lot of training time on the front end to get local capacity on how to use something like the substantial damage estimator. To the question earlier of what causes things to fail. In my experience after this storm, it was definitely accounting for substantial damage. And there's a lot of there's a lot of fear, I think, in the floodplain community about capturing these costs while also trying to make sure people can get over the counter permits and can keep moving, and that they aren't the sole person that's stopping a permit process from happening. And I'll tell you straight up, the floodplain code, a lot of its interpretation, a lot of its local interpretation. Go to the state and and ask them, what does this code mean? Well, they'll tell you, well, it's your code. You tell me what it means. That is to say, I think there really is an ability, if we're going to be stuck, well, not stuck, if we're going to have flood codes that we need to apply and that will constantly get a little bit more restrictive for good reason, something like the substantial damage and capturing those costs really needs to be looked at. And I think that honestly is a discussion at the state level and quite honestly at the retailer level. We need to have the ability. It's 21st century. Everybody's got an app for everything. Why don't we have an app where no matter if you're going to Lowe's or you're going to Home Depot, everybody's information is working. You're getting NOAs that are auto-populated, and it spits out something that is universally usable, like in an Excel sheet. So I can take it to any community. I can go in and hand change things. Having the ability to come up with a general value of work that isn't guessed at by a community, or you don't have to have a full RS means, the ability to go look at what your local costs for labor are. We need to break down those walls. It should not be a matter of I have to pay for an RS means or whatever its equivalent to be able to know what it costs to hang sheetrock or what it costs to get a skilled tradesman in there to redo a panel. There really is an opportunity, I think, for the retailers, for the state, for the local communities to all come together to sort of refine this process from the substantial damage standpoint and take out some of the fear from the staff, make it easier for any contractor that's coming down here who may not have experience in Florida or may not have done a substantial damage estimation before, how to make that process streamlined and less scary. Because what we're seeing is, especially if you're an owner builder, I have to sit down and I've got to spend 30 or 40 minutes, or my floodplain administrator's got to spend 30 or 40 minutes to you to explain how to capture these costs, why it's important, and how to avoid the appearance that we're phasing these projects to try and circumvent capturing those costs. I'd love to hear somebody up the chain tell me how we bring these groups together.
So this is a great idea, and this is exactly why we're here. And so I think this idea of, I don't know how you want to we've obviously captured what you said, but you can probably capture it in a little better detail. The QR code or the link on the screen, that's an opportunity to say, hey, as it relates to X, here's a way we can streamline part of the permitting process by doing some of these things. These are the groups we would need to bring together. These are the sorts of things that we would need to do. And so there is an opportunity as part of this process to figure that out. And this is why we're here today, because I do think there are these things that we do have a construction workforce problem, whether it's after a disaster or just in general. We have contractors and even designers that aren't from this community, and they aren't from coastal communities, and they don't always understand the process of what it takes. And so I would say put that in there as something that's not all initiatives and priorities or actions or projects have to be things that are physical built things. Some of them are programmatic. We've heard a number of times around this table today. We have a workforce sector strategy that we need to create around the whole construction industry, the whole building industry. What does that look like? How do we build that programmatically out? And where does that live? And where does that start and begin and end? And so I think those are the ideas that we want to capture. We obviously are taking notes. This is recorded, so we can capture it to the best, but you're the expert and you understand this tool better than probably any of us from your experience at the state. So how do we make that so anybody can understand it? How do we leverage that so it can be a tool that the community as a whole is able to use? So thank you for sharing that. All right, we have about 18 minutes left. I don't know how much people want to keep going, or if there's other things that people want to keep talking about, we can go to 4:30. We do still need to get to public comment. Are there any other, oh, Frank, I know you have something.
Of course, yeah. I just want to throw in one other thing that we haven't really touched on, but as it was in one of your early slides, as we think more about modular building on the horizon, we see more and more of that. I think we should be thinking about how that plugs into the local permitting. The modular stuff is permitted essentially at a state level, stamped by a third party, but then it's got to plug into local, site and utility connection and all that. Where are the opportunities to start doing the education piece of that now so that people understand how to interact with that? And are there some things that we can learn from how the modular industry does third-party permitting? Essentially, can we use that as a way to fast track some of what we do, especially when we get bottlenecked behind a storm?
Got a question related to that. Mobile homes, quote unquote. I mean, you talk about affordable housing, there's an affordable housing model, it's mobile homes. And so, but given the challenges of resilience, climate, land use, how are you guys dealing with that issue or approaching it? Or are you just not? I mean, I'm asking as a neophyte to what's happening in Florida.
Well, I mean, mobile homes don't fare well in hurricanes.
No, I get that. but I'm
We've
just
seen
saying
over and
from a-
over again. And actually, some of our worst and our biggest loss of workforce housing as a result of the storm, whether it was flooding or blew away or surge or whatever it was in our coastal communities, the mobile home communities. And so we do have to come up with a solution as part of this conversation. And Dan, I know, has shared in a couple of the other, let's leverage those areas, because those are actually in many cases in closest proximity to where the workforce needs to be. So it solves some other things around transportation. So how do we start to look at those mixed use workforce centers, employment centers, as opportunities to reimagine how we get the sort of density that we were getting with mobile homes?
I didn't mean to open up a Pandora's box, but I was
No,
curious
I think
about that.
What we need to do is agree with John, mobile homes don't fare well. Manufactured homes do fare well, and they are significantly less expensive, and they don't last as long, the life of a manufactured home. But if you look at Cudjoe Key, when Irma went through, the manufactured homes that were properly installed to the Florida Building Code did very well, and they're very cost effective. So it is something that should be on the table.
The other element of manufactured home and mobile homes is the permitting and approval process for design is one place, right? And it's one stamp that occurs. And so I think if we try and compare that to say, hey, can we aggregate to less number of eyes that have to look at something in order to get to an outcome, is part of the question of you need less employees if you can get streamlined.
And mobile homes probably wasn't the right term, because they're really not mobile. You truck them to the site, they're put on a foundation, and that's kind of the end of the story.
Well, right. Are they built to the HUD code or are they built to IBC? There's a big differentiation. And then if they're built to the HUD code, are they secured to a foundation?
Right.
Or, you're going to put wheels on it and take it down the road? Pretty different. One of the things I think we should keep in mind about mobile home parks for workforce housing is they're already platted for very small lots. That in and of itself is just a huge win. If we could take an acre or two of straight up commercial dirt and lay it out for, mobile home size lots, we'd get a lot farther than what we currently do.
The only problem with that, Frank, is because they are so small and now they have to all be elevated. You can't get to them because you don't have any room for the stairs, or in some cases, ramping or whatever else you need. Because now they're all going to be required to be brought to elevation.
Right. As soon as
but
you have
that's more-
substantial damage in there or repetitive loss, basically you're putting these things in cradles. Now, I'd like to dovetail off of that and say, what are we talking about with regards to backyard, apartments, or coming up with a way to transition what many people think is a problem of short-term rentals into longer-term leased workforce housing. We're in a community where we have no non-floodplain zone. So it's really difficult to talk about this alternative housing or mobile homes or homes that aren't site built, because it's just not feasible to do on an island or a coast, at least in Florida. But we do have a lot of short-term rentals in our community. And the question of can you sort of sand off some of the harder problems that come along with short-term rentals, VRBOs, whomever, and offer that to workforce housing in a way that the homeowners see a benefit to having those folks there, and still sort of give people the ability to have a little bit of their own living space. They don't feel like they're always living in a hotel. Maybe talk about what we can do about allowing for the accessory structures in backyards, like you're starting to see on the West Coast, to try and deal with some of those localized problems of housing unavailability. You know, maybe that first or second year teacher who just moved to the area would be totally okay in living in a carriage house in somebody's backyard, if the zoning could figure out how to be okay with the carriage house, because the codes oftentimes are aesthetic in nature and don't want the bulk.
So you missed the last session, Jason. We had a whole conversation about accessory dwelling units.
There we go.
And it is something that, so this has been a conversation around Lee County as a whole for a while, around how do we, you know, some places allow accessory dwelling units. It gets back to this idea of that Terry opened up with, is it's this idea of political will. You know, ultimately that policy gets adopted or not. And so on a variety of opportunities in municipalities, it has gone to the council, and they haven't been approved. Some of the communities do have accessory dwelling units. So there is an opportunity that we discussed in the last workshop to look at what does an accessory dwelling unit possibility or overlay look like for the entire county, including the municipalities, and then how would you be able to make that work related to infrastructure? So whether that's transportation. So Amy brought up, you know, you take Cape Coral and you add an extra unit to every single already, you know, 4 units per acre. What does that do to the infrastructure that was planned based on the initial, you know, and how do we start to solve for those things and plan in advance? So we did have a really rich conversation. So if you want, you can go back and watch it.
Gotcha.
If you have 2 hours this weekend, or you just want to listen to it, or, you know, you having a hard time sleeping tonight. We did have a robust conversation about this idea of how do we get to accessory dwelling units as a possibility to not only solve some of our workforce challenge, we have to also remember we have an aging population here too. And so how does that become a mechanism? And we have wait times at all of our senior living facilities, and it's like years, not like months. And so how does this become also an opportunity to solve for our, not just our workforce, but our aging population that also lives here? So there are a number of ways that this can be framed. Messaging is part of it. Understanding the infrastructure and the capacity it takes is part of it. But, you know, when we have a 10,000 square foot home with, you know, 5 or 8 bathrooms, and we just want to add an accessory dwelling unit, I'm not sure where the additional draw is on the utilities compared to the other, you know, 5 bathrooms that already existed. But there is a possibility of how we look at accessory dwelling units as a different option, or you know, something we could consider as part of an overlay or part of a county-wide option for some policy change.
And if you're worried about flooding, put it up over a garage and we can get it 14 feet up in the air, no problem.
All right. Is there any other burning questions or comments from the branch or from the panel? I know everybody's ready to go home. I can just feel it. Permitting. I didn't think we'd go for 2 hours on permitting. So here we are, you know. I just want to highlight sort of the high level things that we sort of talked about. There's this idea of some sort of universal permit process and I don't want to call it an application because every community has some differences, but there is some initial review options there. There's this idea of how do we leverage technology? What are the examples or technologies being used to maybe do that first permit review? There's some lessons learned from Cape Coral on some of their permitting processes that they've automated that they've had to pull back because of XYZ. There's some communication opportunities. There's a sector, part of the sector strategy around education workforce for the whole construction industry, not just the workforce within the construction industry, but the whole sector as a whole. What did I miss?
Mixed use.
Dan's, yeah, there we go. Dan, we have to end the week with mixed use. So those are some of the things that we touched on and we captured today. But again, please make sure you leverage this as an opportunity. If there are things that you think about or you know of other examples, like you can literally drop a link in there of, hey, this is how they're doing it in community XYZ. Maybe this is something that we consider prioritizing. The other thing we said was, what does it look like to have a universal permit review software, permit whatever, I don't know what's e-permitting software that is used across the entire county. Did I miss anything?
I don't want to miss it because it came from the last land use thing as well. The idea about raising the level of knowledge and education across the board. You know, we talked about doing that like a planning academy for city council people or planning board members, but maybe, you know, carrying that over to, you know, the building officials and developers, et cetera, as it relates to the permitting process. So, yeah.
Jen, did you have something?
I just wanted to remember our friends online. If
Oh.
they had any questions, comments, closing remarks.
Do any of our panelists online have anything to add? So Craig, Audra, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing from Sanibel. So since the hurricane passed, we have made a big effort to try and streamline permitting processes, and a big piece of that was trying to take permits that may have required a long form application in front of the Planning Commission involving a public hearing, and taking that administratively. And in the context of the storm, I think it's been well received, and we expect that it's going to work as we hope. But of course, that's a loss in transparency with the public. And so I just want to throw that out there as an acknowledgement that if you're going to take transparency away from a permitting process, that there should be maybe a reciprocal emphasis on more transparency in public policy. So changes in the land development code, maybe more outreach to the community, more outreach to the builders and the contractors. And so that's really my closing comment.
Thanks, Craig. That's a good one.
This is Jackie from Bonita. I enjoyed the discussion today. I will agree with some of the participants that the idea of a uniform process does sound appealing, but like some of the other panelists suggested, there's so many different nuances through different jurisdictions because of zoning regulations, drainage regulations, and even flood ordinance regulations. I know for us as part of the hurricane, the bulk of our plan review is just doing our substantial improvement analysis and just making sure that, you know, homeowners are, you know, when they want to rebuild, they're doing it properly. And then that too, that we are in compliance with our flood ordinance, because that in itself helps our residents get the best discount that we can provide them on their flood insurance. And then too, we just don't want to put someone in harm's way. So, but that's, you know, the bulk of our backlog is just the substantial improvement reviews. And definitely looking forward to seeing how we can all work together to help streamline things that we can streamline. I love the push button terminology. I think, you know, we have a couple things that we try to do over the counter or electronically, but I do look forward to seeing how we can also enhance our service to the community.
Thank you. Audra?
The struggles that we're having are certainly mirrored by our peers here in Lee County. And I just wanted to throw out there that we're always on the lookout for ways to improve. And I did take some notes today, and I'll be happy to share those with our leadership as well. And I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, if there aren't any other comments, I'm going to close out this portion of the workshop and we will move into public comment. So name and organization.
Oh, yes. Hello, Marcia Ellis here, speaking on behalf of myself, Interloop Working Group, Responsible Growth Management Coalition. And I'm just going to say that I think that the idea of the regional planning makes great sense. I don't know why that we moved away from that. And the use of the permitting app or a consistent tool makes great sense as well as you have people move. I'll point out that the differences that we have in permitting are because we have different geophysical properties and hydrology in different areas and regions of the county. And even within Lee County unincorporated, there are different areas that have different planning objectives and goals. So it's always place-based because buildings are attached to land. So you have to look at those characteristics in making these decisions. You can't just rely it's specific. I think that restricting permits to recovery or moving them in two different directions makes a lot of sense. And if growth is being managed and you're having to utilize the workforce for recovery, that makes sense to me. And then maybe if there's a financial hardship on development, having money, suspending interest payments, a pool of money to help offset those delays for growth that would have occurred. I'll also say that it's a different experience for a single user versus someone who's a builder or making big developments. And that also, do all of the reviewers have to be on site? Why not utilize reviewers that can work remotely or come in and respond to disaster, like traveling nurses, that we get having people move into disaster places to help with some of this stuff. That this is a resiliency initiative is an opportunity to reconsider things. And if you don't have enough workforce to get stuff done, then you can't reflect to create any kind of situational analysis of what's happened. I also say that modular working with extruders, systems, precast, all of those are ways to build resilient housing quickly. And we always have to ask ourselves if we're building in ways that reduce future risk. Having exit surveys for employees that are leaving or satisfaction surveys about what part of your job you don't like. The ERP and the permitting processes of the agencies and those pre-applications, those are the timing and ordering of those things, there's a problem. Permitting cheap stuff is going to result in millions of cubic yards of debris, which are later going to cost us money down the road. And rushing through permitting in areas where it's not appropriate is also going to create debris. And then incentives to exceed those standards and codes are important, as well as prioritizing developments that have a mechanism for permanent affordability. I think those people should go to the front of the line.
Thank you. Any other public comment? All right, great. Well, thank you all very much. I just want to say thank you to our panel and to the branch members who've been here all week.